So welcome everyone. My name is Tamara Wood and I'm a visiting fellow at the Andrew and Renata Kaldor Centre for International Refugee Law at the University of New South Wales. And I have the great fortune to be joining you today to chair this panel, which is titled Nothing About Us Without Us, Incorporating Lived Experiences of Displacement into International Law Scholarship. Part of the extended program for the ANZSIL Conference. I'm joining you today from the land of the Moonina people in Hobart in Tasmania, and I'd like to pay my respects to their elders past, present and emerging, and to acknowledge also the Aboriginal people in Tasmania who are the custodians of this land today. So as I said, the title of today's panel is Nothing About Us Without Us, Incorporating Lived Experiences of Displacement in International Law Scholarship. So in one sense, this is a discussion about international law relating to displacement or forced migration, and questions of whether and how the voices of those who have been displaced are incorporated into that field and into scholarship relating to it. In another sense, though, I think the themes of this panel are relevant across all fields of international law, about the role that scholars play and issues of representation within scholarship and with international law more generally. So international law relating to displacement or forced migration sits within the broader body of international human rights law. So international law relating to displacement imposes obligations on states not to return people to a place where they're at risk of persecution or other serious harm, but also to ensure certain socioeconomic rights and other rights of people who've been displaced, whether internally or across borders, to cooperate at the international and regional levels in protecting refugees and other displaced persons, and to facilitate longer term solutions for those who've been forced to leave their homes. So like any area of international law relating to displacement is fundamentally about the obligations of states. But of course, like other areas of international human rights law, it's very much about individuals. So while states have the obligations and clearly an interest in this field of international law, it's individuals who have the most to gain or even to lose through its implementation. Now, because of this, in recent years, scholars and others have begun to look more critically at how international law relating to displacement is generated, understood, and applied in practice. And in particular, to look at how and by whom international law scholarship relating to displacement is generated. And this parallels, I suppose, similar questions and developments in other fields of international law as well. Within international law on displacement, there's been quite an emphasis on the geographic source or the location of international law scholarship. And there's a clear concern about the bias in international law scholarship relating to displacement towards authors in the global north, despite the fact that the vast majority of displaced people reside in the global south. Today we're going to zero in on a more specific question, and that is about representation of those with lived experience of displacement within international law relating to displacement, and in particular within international law scholarship. And this is an issue that has been garnering recent attention, not only in scholarship, but also in practice. Some of you will be aware that in 2018, member states of the United Nations General Assembly adopted a new global compact on refugees. This is a non-binding set of political commitments, fundamentally to enhance cooperation in refugee protection. And in association with this compact, and under the rallying call of Nothing About Us Without Us, refugees and others who have experienced displacement have been collectivising, strategising, and demanding a place in the international and other fora, not only to tell their stories, but to actively influence, drive, and contribute to decisions about laws and policies that impact their lives. So what does that mean for international law scholarship? What exactly does nothing about us without us mean? What does it actually require, not only of those who have lived experience of displacement, but for others working in this field as well? Now, these are some of the issues that we want to explore in this panel, and I'm beyond delighted to introduce the wonderful panel of speakers that we have to share their perspectives on this topic. Now, I won't give their full biographies because you can access those in the flyer for this session, but just to introduce them briefly and in the order in which they will first speak. We have Dixson with us, who is a PhD candidate at the Australian National University and an early career scholar of displacement and forced migration, who focuses on issues of gender and sexuality. Tina has very extensive experience in both academic and policy fields, and has been driven and informed in her work by her own experience of displacement. Tina has engaged in multiple levels with the UN, including by conducting a gender audit of the UN Global Compact on Refugees during its development. Tristan Harley is another early career scholar in international law relating to forced displacement, and a candidate at the Kaldor Centre for International Refugee Law at UNSW. Tristan's current and recent research focuses on the contribution and participation of refugees within the international refugee law regime, and looks at how they have been included in the past and how they can be more meaningfully included at present. Rifaie Tammas is a Syrian activist and a PhD candidate at the University of Sydney. And he has over 8 years of consultancy and research experience in Syria, Turkey, and Australia. In his research, Rifaie focuses on authoritarian politics in the contemporary Middle East, in particular in Syria. And in his professional capacity, he has extensive experience in developing and implementing and coordinating mentoring programs for students and academics at Australian universities, including those who have experienced displacement. Professor Susan Rimmer is with us. She's the director of the Griffith University Policy Innovation Hub. And Susan has extensive expertise working on governance, human rights, and international law issues, in particular from a feminist lens. Susan is also the leader of the climate justice theme of the Griffith Climate Action Beacon, and she has previously worked with UNHCR, the United Nations Refugee Agency, among others. We do have a fifth panellist who we hope will be with us shortly, and that is Associate Professor Katerina Teaiwa. Katerina is of Barnaban y Kiribati and African American heritage. She was born and raised in Fiji and is an associate professor at the Australian National University. Katerina's research explores the impact of British, Australian and New Zealand phosphate mining on communities in the Central Pacific, including studying the ways in which Indigenous Barnabans make sense of their history of displacement. So the panel will run as a sort of Q&A style. I have a series of questions to pose to our panellists for their thoughts and for discussion. And some of those questions centre around the why. Why is it important to incorporate and represent lived experiences in scholarship and international law relating to forced displacement? How can and should this incorporation be achieved? And what is the role of academics, academic institutions, but also individual researchers and scholars in this objective? We'll spend, I think, around 50 minutes of this session hearing from our panellists on these questions. And after that, we'll open the floor to all of you to share your own thoughts, responses, and to ask questions of our panellists. So if you'd like to intervene at that point, I would ask you to please use the raise hand function in Zoom. If you have any trouble finding that, perhaps just place a note in the chat to say that you'd like to speak. I know sometimes it seems to disappear. Please also feel very free to add comments, thoughts, questions to the chat as we go through, and I'll do my very best to keep on top of those and to bring those into our discussion as well. Just a short note that this session, as you probably are aware, is being recorded because we'd very much like to share the discussion with others who are not able to join the session today. So with that housekeeping out of the way, let's begin with the question of why. And Tina, perhaps I can start with you. So as someone whose own experience of displacement has been a central driving force in your own work, why does this matter? Why is it important to incorporate lived experiences of displacement into research and scholarship on the topic? Over to you, Tina.
Thanks, Tamara. I'd like to first begin by acknowledging that I'm joining from the lands of Ngunnawal and Ngambri people down in the ACT. I was at the event this morning for the launch of Aboriginal-led organisation here in Canberra, and then Ngunnawal elder really gifted all people with the word hello in Ngunnawal language, which is Yuma. We are just fresh out of Natick Week, and I think it's a real responsibility for everybody to learn a little bit more which lands you're living on. I guess, we have to start from the premises that the academic knowledge production has been really dominated for quite a long time by white, cisgender and heterosexual perspectives. And we also have to really acknowledge the colonial approaches to some parts of the scholarship. So for example, if we look at anthropology or ethnography, researchers go to research the others, right? We go into these cultures, or they go into these cultures that they, want to see what's happening. However, this has created significant impacts on what kind of knowledge are produced, how they're distributed, and who benefits. We tend to see quite often refugees being seen as people with no agency and no knowledge, and they get to be represented on these two, extreme scales. On the one hand, you're either very high performing, you're world-renowned somebody, doctor, specialist, and so on and so forth, or you're on sort of the other end of being an illiterate. And I think in here, we're also that, level of literacy is getting to be judged again by the Western conceptions of what gets to be counted as knowledge, because we know for very long in tribal knowledges or indigenous knowledges actually get to be, disregarded. And sort of one example kind of outside of the refugee space, but for example, cesarean was created by women in Eritrea long before in Europe male doctors knew to wash their hands before they went, from a dead body to a living body. And when the women were already successfully delivering those medical procedures, and then white doctors saw that and, borrowed, took, learned, whatever you want to use the word, that practice of cesarean to Europe without any acknowledgement where this kind of types of knowledges come from. So we do get to judge, based on the Western standards, how we practice that knowledge production. In the modern day, in terms of refugee research, refugees do get to be occasionally, used as research subjects for different kinds of projects. However, even in those spaces, our roles are often really well defined to either tell the story, and I think doesn't matter how much still advocacy exists on that point, that it's not just about storytelling, that still continues, even if people are saying, well, you can actually share what you want. Or we have to speak exactly to the research question without any possibility to raise anything else that could be outside or could be in contradiction to the kind of a predetermined conception, what is getting researched. Often there is no acknowledgement of these contributions. There is no come back to check on quotes or to show what kind of work gets published. There is no sharing of the results of their research, and there are definitely no benefits that are given back to the group in a very short term, whether that is financial for participating to the research, or actually that research does change something for a specific group. Who gets the benefit are quite often the academics, for whom that becomes the career progression, and groups just get to be sort of used and researched for those purposes. A few years ago, I was asked to participate in a research project on LGBTIQ refugees, where I was assured that the quotes will be checked with me, that I will get to see the chapter before it gets to be finalized, and then all my emails got unanswered, and that person has a doctoral title now, still ignores all my emails, and does not attend the events, for example, that are organized by LGBTIQ refugees, even though, the thesis was on that. So, there is a lot of kind of those experiences that are happening. US-based Professor Nora Bernstein has coined a term called epistemic exploitation that draws on the ideas from Miranda Fricker of epistemic injustice, where the marginalized group has the burden and is asked to educate the dominant group on the nature of their oppression, and yet all of that is happening for free, and quite often is actually met with disbelief because the truth that they're getting produced are actually getting inconvenient. So I think, coming sort of back to the idea why we actually have to involve the people in is because we can no longer really practice the research or the policy, or any advocacy that, creates these brick walls between the objective researchers and the passive, in this context, refugees. I think we're at this stage when this is no longer an invitation or some kind of a good practice. It's actually an obligation because, in the context of a lot of information, in the context of actual, I guess, ethics and, seeing a huge rise of feminist research, for example, that it is an obligation to actually be engaging with those experiences. If we're not engaging with the lived experiences, we actually missing out on so many crucial points that quite often people who do not have lived experience just simply do not see. And let me make you an example. I was involved in the Global Refugee Compact work. Later on, I was, we all know that the text of the Global Compact does not specifically reference sexuality or LGBTIQ+ people, even though the first original draft was. So there's a whole range of articles on the gaps in the Global Refugee Compact, and there's not a single article that identifies exclusion of LGBTIQ+ people as a gap in the Global Refugee Compact. So without actually engaging with people who are able to bring those perspectives, a lot of researchers simply missing out on that. I guess I'm going to stop on here, but I'm happy to talk about sort of the ways how to do it in subsequent questions. Thanks, Tamara.
Thanks so much, Tina. Your comments about sort of controlling the narrative very much resonate with my own experience as a refugee law practitioner and supporting people in refugee status determination, because this is one of the most fundamental things about international refugee law is the refugee definition. And to bring yourself within that field of law, you need to fit your narrative very much into a set of clear criteria. And perhaps that's something we can come back to a bit later. Turning to look a little bit more now at international refugee law itself, I'll turn to Tristan, because this is a topic that you've explored from an historical perspective, as well as looking at what's happening now, and ask how much of an issue is this? How much exclusion really is there? And what do we know about the participation of people who've experienced displacement within international law relating to forced displacement? Over to you, Tristan.
Thanks, Tamara, and I'd like to start by acknowledging that I'm joining from the lands of the Gadigal today and pay my respects to their elders, both past, present and emerging. In answer to your question, I think this is a serious issue that needs to be addressed. Let me start with the history first of all. It's often assumed that persons with lived experience of displacement did not play a substantive role in the development of early international refugee law. However, this is not entirely the case. Two of the first academic commentaries on the 1951 Refugee Convention were prepared and written by Nehemiah Robinson and Paul Weiss, both of whom participated in the drafting of the 1951 Refugee Convention and had lived experience of displacement. The political theorist and philosopher Hannah Arendt similarly wrote from personal experience of becoming a stateless refugee when she articulated some of the central moral tenets of international refugee law, including the idea of the right to have rights. In terms of lawmaking itself, the initial idea of creating a binding international treaty with respect to refugees was first proposed by a refugee and jurist Jacques Rubenstein in 1927. And when UNHCR first appointed a High Commissioner to lead its office in 1950, it appointed a High Commissioner with lived experience of displacement, Gerard van Hoven Gerthardt. In addition to both of these points, refugees were also substantially involved in the drafting of both the 1933 Refugee Convention and the 1951 Refugee Convention relating to refugees. And their influence in these processes helped to develop some of the central obligations of international refugee law, including the obligation of non-refoulement, which you spoke about earlier, as well as other key rights provisions. Now, since these origins, individuals with lived experience of displacement and groups with lived experience of displacement have been largely sidelined from the development of both international refugee law scholarship and international refugee law making. While displacement has increasingly included in the global south since the 1950s, the global north has retained and arguably expanded upon its control over the production of scholarship in relation to international refugee law. This has arguably led to a disproportionate research emphasis on issues relating to the global north, and it has undoubtedly contributed to blind spots in our understanding. When we look at law banking itself, there have been some positives recently. The 2018 Global Compact on Refugees recognises that responses are most effective when they effectively engage refugees in their design and implementation. There is also a recognition of the need for diversity now, and not just to rely upon the perspectives of European white male intellectuals, as previously occurred back in the early days. But similarly, there's limited progress in other areas. Most decisions that materially impact upon the rights of refugees still occur without any form of consultation with refugees themselves. Similarly, in particular places in the world, various governments act to deliberately silence the voices of refugees, particularly where such voices seek to expose human rights violations that may be occurring. And so some pertinent examples in relation to this include the attempted ban on mobile phone usage in the Australian context, as well as in the Bangladeshi context in Cox's Bazar. And similarly, in relation to the main institutions in the field, UNHCR, for example, despite being largely refugee-led in its origins, has moved away from this practice and has become largely a bureaucratic organisation led by non-refugees, and it hasn't appointed a High Commissioner since 1950 with lived experience of displacement. So clearly there's more work to be done in this space. Thank you.
Thanks, Tristan. And I don't know if it's heartening or actually more disappointing to think that we actually began fairly well in this space and have gone backwards. You know, to hear about how refugees not only were just consulted, but actually a driving force in the early days. I'm really pleased to now welcome Katerina. Thank you for joining us. Katerina, I gave a brief introduction with your background earlier, so it's very nice to see you as well. And I'd like to turn to you now and come back to this idea of knowledge and who produces knowledge and what kinds of knowledge are produced and used, because your work with the Indigenous Barnabans in the Pacific has really focused on how those who are forced to move perceive their own movement. So, you know, what can this tell us about, I suppose, the connection or the disconnect between law and policy on the one hand and lived experiences of displacement? So my question to you is why is representation and the bringing in of people with lived experience important, not just from a legal perspective, but to knowledge production itself? Over to you, Katerina.
Thank you, and apologies for my late arrival. I am literally moving between meetings, and somehow magically I'm one of those people who's managed to travel outside Australia in this very challenging time of COVID and other forms of borders. So I am talking to you from Tamaki, Auckland, in Aotearoa, New Zealand. So paying respect to the multiple tribes whose lands we are on here, but not normally I'm on Ngunnawal and Ngambri country in Canberra from the ANU. And your question about the Barnaban experience is very apt, particularly this here in Aotearoa, New Zealand. It's Kiribati Language Week. So different Pacific countries' languages will be celebrated, those sorts of programs are sort of mainstreamed through educational, health, and other forms, other systems acknowledging minority communities in New Zealand, and introducing people to different aspects of their language. And in the context of Kiribati Language Week, the lost Banabin language is very relevant, and there's been recent media stories about that and the nature of Banabin displacement. So when we're talking about the Indigenous Banabin experience, I guess compared with what others have been speaking about, there's quite a historical dimension to that. And we're talking about displacement under the colonial period. And so we're thinking about lessons that can be learned in terms of the historical and colonially induced experiences of displacement, which are ongoing and still lived and felt in the Pacific. So Kiribati communities, there are at least two major displacements, one from Kiribati to the Solomon Islands, which was kind of this social engineering sort of move by the British government, but other scholars have pointed out very much also in relationship to nuclear testing in Kiribati and testing that was done in the eastern part of Kiribati in terms of populations that were moved from southern Kiribati to the Phoenix Islands and then to the Solomon Islands. So that's one group that's been displaced in the 1950s under the colonial period. And then you have the Banabans, who were displaced from their island in the western part of Kiribati to Fiji in 1945 as a World War II, and also British colonialism, and also phosphate mining. So sort of three major kind of events that all focused on this 6 square kilometer island in the Central Pacific, and resulted in the displacement of Banabans first to war camps under Japanese occupation, and then after the war gathered together by the company that was owned by Australia, New Zealand, and Great Britain. All three countries owned the mining company, and then moved to Fiji in 1945, and basically were dropped off and set up with army tents to live in, and their lives have proceeded from there since 1945. So Banabans over the decades have raised their case in multiple international fora, but it's complicated by the colonial context in which they were removed, and by the fact that for Indigenous peoples who are relocated and moved or displaced, the way in which they frame their experiences isn't the same as how it would be framed today in terms of refugee experiences or refugee status. So the language that people use to describe who they are and what they are in terms of the countries, the origin, their places of origin, and the new countries that they live in are quite different, but they are still, they still have experienced trauma, displacement, are living in a new context in which they are not the Indigenous peoples of the land, and there are many, many, many issues that arise from that, not just legally, but culturally, socially, environmentally, economically, and so on. Banabans, like many Indigenous peoples in the Pacific, were very much about attempting to keep their self-determination, their autonomy, and their independence. But because of the British colonial context in which they were in, unlike Nauru, for example, or Tuvalu, which was part of colony where their phosphate was mined, they weren't afforded that same status of independence for their islands. So they feel like they've had all of these huge historical losses, and now at this minority community in Fiji that often falls through the legal and the governance and the infrastructural cracks in Fiji. They're quite in a remote part of northern Fiji. At the moment, we have Banaban people on the ground who are trying to do this social an environmental mapping of issues and resources and COVID and everything that's going on Rambi Island where the Banabans are at the moment. And they're discovering a huge host of problems and challenges that the Banabans have been experiencing since 1945, still ongoing, still unresolved, and those problems and those challenges are growing. So I guess the question is, what can we learn from these populations that have already been displaced, already moved around historically, who are still experiencing these things, especially as we talk about the potential for climate migration or climate refugees. Climate refugees is not a term that Pacific people are comfortable with at all. There's a lot of discussion around migration with dignity and those sorts of things, but Banabans, like many people in the Pacific, now already displaced, are now facing potential further displacement because of what's happening in terms of climate change on the island that they're on now. So it's really important to take this deep historical view of people that have already been moved around for all kinds of reasons in the Pacific, but particularly the colonial context, and to think about the language that people use to describe their experiences, but also the different kinds of, survival strategies and survival techniques that they've come up with to deal with all of the legal, the social, economic, and governance gaps that they've faced over the years. And Banaban people have faced many, including politically and with a trust fund. They were supposed to have so many different things. But one thing the Banabans have definitely realized is that money is not often the solution to their problems. Like, you can't whack a bunch of money at a displaced population and think that something magical is going to happen and everything's going to be okay. So from that particular experience, there's a lot to learn in terms of thinking with people on the ground and learning from their stories, which for Banabans, they now have, 70 plus years of kind of thinking about what it means to be moved from one island to another, and it's not so straightforward.
Thanks, Katerina. I think this is a really powerful illustration of how the narrative of people who move can be so different to the narrative within international fora and international law. And I think even if we think about the quite recent Global Compact on refugees, despite doing some good things, I feel like it was very much driven by a narrative of mass influx from the global south to the global north and the so-called European refugee crisis and so on, and that this is a narrative that dominates international law relating to displacement, but as you're showing, that historically and now is not the narrative that is experienced by many of the impacted communities. And I'm really interested that you raised the issue of climate change and movement, and because I feel like, and I'd be interested in others' thoughts on this, but in many ways the recent work on climate change and displacement has been at least more attuned to people's perspectives, and not least driven by some of the people on this panel and joining us in this session today, that there has been a recognition that that dominant narrative doesn't fit with climate change impacted communities. But I think we're not yet there at recognizing that that dominant narrative doesn't fit with many other displaced people as well. Let's turn now to think about scholarship and the exclusion really of people with lived experience, especially in more recent years, from international law scholarship relating to forced displacement. And Rifaie, I'd like to turn to you because you've worked a lot with people in academia in Australia and elsewhere through mentoring programs and other programs. And I read a recent article on refugee inclusion in research design and research studies by Krista Kunzelman. And Kunzelman states that the exclusion of refugees from research design means that the populations that have the most to gain from research conducted about them are excluded from shaping this research. So something similar to what Tina was saying about, that it's not just about consulting, but it's about, which questions are asked in the first place. So I'm interested to know if you agree with this statement about the exclusion of refugees and people with lived experience, And what do you see as some of the main obstacles to their inclusion and representation within research and scholarship? Over to you, Rifaie.
Thank you, Tamara. Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for having me. Speaking to you from the land of the Gadigal land of the Eora Nation. I would like to pay my respect to elders past, present, and emerging. I would like to also thank my fellow panelists for their input and sharing their amazing insights, particularly Tina. Tina has touched on a lot of the things I was planning to cover, and I started like panicking while she was speaking. Oh my gosh, I need to redo my whole presentation. So I apologize in advance for the repetition, some of the ideas, but perhaps I could shed some light, maybe look at the issue, some of the things that Tina mentioned from a different angle as well. Now, to answer your question, I do agree with what Krista said, that yes, the lack of representation of refugees in research design has been harmful, for sure. But I think we also need to be mindful that not all research or scholarship on refugees, about refugees, is necessarily about benefiting them, benefiting refugees and asylum seekers. I mean, obviously researchers are often motivated by a host, and I don't want to be kind of skeptical here or anything, but I think researchers are often motivated by a host of reasons for conducting their research. Research design is also shaped by government agendas, actions, and perceptions of academics about what they think that could benefit refugees. So again, even with well-meaning academics that they really genuinely want to help and support refugees, this is again, they might go about it in a slightly different way, on a completely different way from how refugees would see it. So I'm saying this because I think before we talk about representation, I think we need to step back, take a step back, and be aware of our own assumptions and motivations for conducting research. And if it's truly about empowering people from lived experience or with lived experience, is what we're trying to do really beneficial, as Tina mentioned? Will it be beneficial to the people of from a refugee background? Only then can the discussion, only with this open and curious attitude, we can start engaging with these communities and work around issues of representation and incorporation of lived experience in the scholarship. So I think that's a really kind of important before we even begin talking about representation incorporation. Because otherwise, I think we run the risk of having tokenistic representations of people lived experience. And I'm sure a lot of people could relate to that when we're often invited to panels, to panels or to join a team, join an organization, and then we realize that our input isn't really taken seriously. I've personally faced this quite a bit, to be honest. And as for, to go more concretely about the obstacles, the main obstacles of the representation and incorporation of lived experience within research and scholarship, I think I've noticed that these communities with lived, people with lived experience are often, there's a certain level of fatigue, I guess, because a lot of these communities are over-researched. So I think we need to build trust. Remember, it's not just about one project. You do one interview and then that's it. It's about maintaining relationships, building those relationships, empowering those individuals, and remembering that they have agency to change their stories, to edit whatever they shared with us. And there are obviously also conceptual or cultural barriers, the way we conceptualize, the way we view people with lived experience. Tina mentioned two extremes of someone who's either like super educated or illiterate, quote unquote. And I think we can also see it, we can also see it in a different way. We can either view people with lived experience as very traumatized or vulnerable, and then the other extreme, super resilient, super successful as well. And another thing I've noticed as well when you're doing research with people with lived experience is that some people might think that the research you're doing is about helping them, that you're part of a government body, you're part of that organization that's giving them aid, especially when you collaborate with those organizations to reach those communities. So I think having, and just like writing it on a page and giving it to them, like that consent form isn't enough. having a discussion about what your research is really about. How is it really going to be beneficial? Sometimes saying, oh yeah, we're hoping that this research will help your community can be misleading, because you need to clarify, what does that really mean concretely? Sometimes this means that really your research won't help that family that you're interviewing with, that individual. And be clear about this is really important, because that person may not want to be speaking with you if they think that there is nothing they're going to get out of it. Concretely, that is. Other people would be more than happy to share their expertise regardless of any material benefit or anything else. They just love to engage and share. And I remember certainly, like I was engaged in a huge national project a couple of years ago, and I remember that some of the people, when we were interviewing them, they had no idea about what this whole project is about. They were just like accepted because a certain organization that we're working with reached out to them, and they thought we were part of their organization or part of the government. So I was an interpreter back then. So I think what I found myself trying to explain about that whole project, and explaining to them that what it's really about. And like I said, clarifying that it may not be beneficial in that very concrete, materialistic or material way. I think I might stop there, and we might come back to some of the issues. Thank you. Back to you, Tamara.
Right, thanks so much. I think there's a lot in there for us to reflect on as researchers about, you know, assumptions, both personal and cultural assumptions, as well as practices that, even though they might look like they're towards a meaningful objective, are not necessarily effective in pursuing it. Let's continue on this discussion about some of the obstacles to really incorporating lived experience into international law scholarship. And Susan, I'll turn to you because you have such wonderful experience in international law across a range of fields, but also I think it's fair to say via a number of different theoretical lenses, to ask, what, in your view, what could international law on displacement learn about representation from other critical perspectives on international law? So critical race perspectives or feminist perspectives and so on, both about the obstacles, but also how to address them. Over to you, Susan.
Sure. Can you hear me okay, everybody?
Very well, thank you.
Yeah, great. So actually listening to all these talented next generation of refugee scholars, I'm also happy to act in this panel as a cautionary tale of times when I've made mistakes in my own journey as an advocate and a researcher around this issue. So I'm really happy to be very honest about getting many of these things wrong in the past. I'd like to start by acknowledging the Jagera and Turrbal people here in Mianjin, and, you know, concede that I'm on the land of forcibly displaced people here, which is one of the issues. Was a displacement scholar for a long time before I realised that I should also be thinking about First Nations displacement as part of my toolbox. It's one of the very many things that I've had to learn the hard way over the years. I want to make 3 points which will be quite clear, hopefully useful for those people who are international law scholars, sort of traditional international law scholars, but also who have a kind of a practitioner or go in and out of worlds. So my first point is that the discipline, I think, actively pushes against the inclusion of direct voice of people that are the subjects of international law. So this partly because of the black box treatment of states, the kind of elevation of sovereignty over other issues. And when we get inside the black box of states, the elevation of elite cis male northern actors, as Tina so beautifully described. And so you see in the hierarchy of international law areas that are prized, you see traditional sovereignty issues, use of force and traditional threats. For example, I think the other issue with refugee law in particular is that refugees are the living proof of state failure in many ways, very challenging, I think, to a state-centric approach of international law. And you'll see in a lot of Security Council, the top of the international law sources, you'll see treatment of displaced peoples as burdens, as destabilising. So where you get a preoccupation with with refugees themselves, they're very much treated in a deficit model, as Professor Jane McAdams' work is so brilliantly described, and I'm always going to take my hat off to Jane's work in this area. So, but even in human rights law, which is sort of my area, or humanitarian law, we still get issues and silences and destabilisation. So you get issues around economic and social rights as being poor cousins to other rights, and I think particularly demographic groups without power, aliens, children, people with disabilities, sexual orientation and gender identity, First Nations people. You can see the weakness in the international human rights system around their inclusion at every level, including representation in UN mechanisms, in international organisations, in civil society organisations, in the academy, at every level. So you can see a slight improvement in the most recent conventions, particularly the Disability Convention, which is what I associate Nothing About Us Without Us from, a very strong disability rights agenda. But most of traditional UN mechanisms just have a serious issue with voice of all kinds. So that's the first point I want to make. So I think increasing a human rights kind of framework around refugee issues is not going to solve our problems necessarily. The second issue, I think, is the limited script, the limited cast of international refugee law studies. So I'm thinking now about the scholarship around international refugee law. And also I have a bit of a darker explanation of this that I've been pondering for many years. There's a through the looking glass quality to refugee law that you don't get in other areas of international scholarship, I think, because there's a significant amount of research in the field that actually kind of equates the person fleeing the threat with the threat. It's a phenomenon that I think is very fundamental to the scholarship around this. So instead of treating Afghans fleeing the Taliban, you see states treating them as if they are the Taliban. This kind of phenomenon is really common, not just in state practice, but also in the securitization of the field and the way that refugees are problematized. So if you treat people that way, you don't have to listen to their voice, right? So it goes beyond exclusion. I think there's a kind of, a way of discounting the credibility of those people. So you see it most clearly in the refugee status determination field around issues of credibility, but it actually, I think these issues of credibility are really, really deep. So the kind of people I've seen escape that kind of dynamic in the fields, and I'm talking globally now, I'm not really talking about Australia, but you see people who've had practitioner experience, who've sort of been shocked into thinking in a more empathetic way. You see people who've got a particular family background, or they're just particularly empathetic people. And you also have people in the field who just want to deal with really big problems, so they're interested in the scale and difficulty of refugee law issues. So I think we have to keep thinking about the cast of characters you see in the international refugee law field, but it's not very diverse, in fact, I think. And then the third point I want to make is there's some really structural disincentives, which was touched on before, the ethics process, but also the incentives of applying for grant money or being promoted. All those incentives actively discouraged voice. Even working with civil society organisations, I've often found, as someone who's worked, been on the board of the Refugee Council and various other organisations, RACS and RELC and whatever, there's serious disincentives always, I think, to including the voice of lived experience in those forums. And it's wrong, even when it's seen as benevolent. So, we've spent a lot of time in my career thinking about how to include people without jeopardising their asylum claims or creating a surplus claim or endangering their family overseas. But there's always creative ways to navigate these issues so that we can include direct voice, and I don't think we were anywhere near creative enough. In resettlement, it was better. So I think there's this idea that with a kind of more durable citizenship comes greater voice, which is what you would expect. But even in resettlement practice, it's pretty pathetic, really. And what's the excuse there? And in the area of durable solutions, you would think that would be an area where you get a direct experience think in terms of good design of development and humanitarian practice, that's what you'd expect, and you don't see it in the kind of durable solutions work. So I've tried to conduct my research from a position of solidarity with groups in a kind of a co-design ally kind of way. And it's been incredibly difficult to navigate that through traditional academia. And it was also hard in the development sector, and it was also hard in human rights organisations. So, and often I think I have not pushed hard enough. So I'm really grateful to see this kind of focus on this issue. So I just want to say to everyone in ANZSIL who's joining us here, we have power in this situation, and we have privilege. We have the privilege of time and safety and the ability to select topics. We have to be much more mindful of the way we share that privilege and power with the communities we are trying to help. If that's our view, I understand not all research has to be driven by, I guess, an imperative to help a community, and that often maybe that desire to help has often been my downfall, I must say. But you know, if there's at least the ability to respect the agency of others, to exercise humility, and to really respectfully navigate issues of power and access in a transparent way, there's got to be a better start to the practices that we've had in the past. So that's where I'll end that.
Thanks so much, Susan, and that's a really powerful summary of the structural barriers that exist, and that, you know, even when people feel individually that they're aiming to do something positive, they might be hampered, or they might be inadvertently or even unknowingly perpetuating some of those issues. You've also given us a nice segue into the sort of second part of our discussion, which is what should and could be done about it. And we're really using up our time because we've had such wonderful input from everyone. So I might ask our panelists to try and if they can, be brief in their responses to these questions, because I want to turn now to what can be done by individuals, by organisations and institutions. And Tristan, I'll start with you, and based on your research into this, what you think can be done to really advance meaningful participation of people with lived experience in the field of international law relating to displacement, and what strategies you're aware of that have or could be successful in this place. Over to you.
Thanks, Tamara. So I think when we're looking at opportunities, we need to take stock of some of the major trends that I think are occurring in the field in this space. I'd just like to draw attention to two of those trends. The first is, I think we're beginning to see the emergence of a cultural and institutional shift away from seeing refugees and persons with lived experience of displacement as kind of passive recipients of humanitarian aid, and towards seeing them as change actors and thought leaders in their own right. And I think this shift has largely occurred due to the successful advocacy of refugees themselves, including Tina and Rifaie, who are on this panel today. And then the second trend I'd like to point towards is the emergence of refugee-led organisations and refugee-led networks that are seeking to influence international law making and its scholarship directly, and to engage with decision makers, including governments. And as scholars and practitioners in the field of international refugee law, I think there is an opportunity to engage with this cultural and institutional shift, as well as to collaborate actively with these refugee-led organisations and networks to help pursue appropriate reform. Importantly, this can and should not be done without refugee leadership. And I think all the kind of aspects of the kind of discipline that have been addressed today kind of point towards the importance of this. In terms of the law itself, there is a need to interrogate whether our legal and policy frameworks are sufficient to ensure the meaningful participation of refugees in decision-making processes. The 1951 Refugee Convention is often critiqued both due to its limited scope in terms of for whom it provides protection, as well as its failures in relation to ensuring adequate responsibility sharing among states around the world. However, another critique of the 1951 Refugee Convention, which is largely a result, I think, a product of its age, is that it establishes almost no obligations to consult with refugees in the design and implementation of responses and in decisions that materially impact their human rights. UNHCR's mandate, which was first established in 1950, similarly establishes no obligation on the organisation to consult with refugees in its decision-making processes. Although admittedly it has done some work to alleviate this through its institutional practice with varying degrees of success and controversy. When we compare this consultative framework to those of other rights regimes, such as those related to Indigenous peoples and those related to persons with disabilities, it is clear that more could be done in this space. The Global Compact on Refugees offers some potential, but we need to think more clearly about when this consultation is needed in relation to refugees and other displaced peoples, and how this should actually be done in practice. And getting beyond the kind of broad claims of including refugees in all decision-making processes that affect them, let's start thinking about those specific decision-making areas. So for example, durable solutions. Let's start thinking about how refugees can be engaged in resettlement policy and in the individual allocation of resettlement places. Let's think about how refugees can be involved in voluntary repatriation arrangements, both individually and through group-based refugee communities as well. And similarly, let's look at how refugees can be involved in program and service delivery on the ground. So let's individually unpack these decision-making areas and explore the contours of how participation can take place.
Thanks so much, Tristan, and especially for keeping such good time. Susan, I've realised that I kind of asked you this question already previously, but I wonder if there's anything else you might like to add on good practices in this space that we could learn from.
Well, I don't think we've quite nailed this in any space, to be honest. So I think we just have to keep insisting that more diversity of all kinds, age, gender, ability, different types of backgrounds is good for knowledge production, is the only way, So, I mean, to me, it still seems completely not, like I've resigned from a few boards because we weren't able to get, better inclusion. So, and I just feel like that's the situation we're up to at the moment. You've got to actually really take a stand on it and really fight for, saying we cannot have, well, I mean, the Refugee Council, I still can't believe the Refugee Council is not led by a refugee after all these years. And I've been making that point to no avail for a really long time. But what is the excuse for that? There's no excuse. No excuse for most of our refugee organisations not to be led by refugees at this point of Australian history. There's just none. So I think we have to be maybe a bit braver too, to just not offer our time and talent to things that are, I guess, to yield the space, So I have a colleague, an incredibly talented colleague, I'm sorry she couldn't be here today, Olivera Simic, is one of the few refugee academics in the field. And, the amount of times I say, you don't want me, you want Ollie, it's nuts. So you have to actively make space for people and actively demand, difference, and we can always get better at that. I feel like it's just an ongoing quest. But you've got to do it without demanding people do unpaid work as well. So there's this big, at UNHCR, we created a Refugee Speakers Bureau, and it was very important that opportunity was a paid opportunity, that people's time was valued. I feel like including people without compensating them properly for their time and their viewpoint is also really wrong. So there's so many levels to this issue of the politics of representation and the politics of presence. I really find it, I'm definitely on a journey with it, and you can spend a lot of effort and still get it wrong. So we have to just get better and better at really putting our critical faculties that we're always honing as academics into this piece, and not be lazy, So yeah, I'm sure Katerina has more thoughts of this than me too.
Thanks, Susan. And I guess just to put out there too an acknowledgement that this requires, particularly those of us who don't have lived experience and are working in this space, to not only not be lazy, but to give up our own privileged places as experts as well. And I think that that's something that doesn't perhaps come naturally to many of us. Let me turn now to you, Rifaie, to ask if you have suggestions or examples of what steps that institutions like universities could take to advance opportunities for scholars with lived experience of displacement. Over to you.
Thank you, Tamara. Thank you so much. I completely agree with what you just said about kind of the role of researchers in advancing opportunities. The way I came to Australia was through a connection by one of the academics at a university I went to, not my current one, and an organization based in the UK called Council for At-Risk Academics. And through a collaboration between this organization and a lot of advocacy on the part of the academic, my old university, I was able to come here. They found a way to kind of, for me to arrive. So I think there are a lot of opportunities out there for collaboration opportunities like this. Academics can organize in their respective universities and, and probably work towards securing some placements or opportunities for researchers to come. There are a lot of organizations in Australia, as well as overseas, where they could, collaborate with and work with identifying those researchers and supporting them. We do have also many researchers from a refugee background here in Australia and elsewhere that they could be better supported. I was involved in a mentoring program for academics from a refugee background a couple of years ago with a number of academics. And one of the issues we identified, to be honest, was finding academics. I mean, we did find academics to be paired with those with academics from with lived experience, but we did face a lot of difficulty. A lot of the time we did not get any responses. And this is before COVID, obviously. Obviously, COVID made it a lot worse. But even before COVID, on a very basic individual level, I think academics are just overworked. I just under a lot of pressure and under a lot of the commitment as, they have a lot of commitments. And I think that also contributed to why we did not get a lot of responses as well. But yeah, I think on a very individual level, if someone from a refugee background reaches out to us, to you, I think it's important to probably try our best to communicate with them, try to help them any way you can. I'm not saying for sure, have an interview them or whatever, or participate in their research. But I think often researchers with lived experience are treated as objects of analysis, as kind of asked to come and share and then goodbye, and that's it. But when they take the lead and do their own research, they face more challenges on an individual level, on a systematic level, on accessing funds, for instance, in even reaching out to academics for support, for expertise. I've been doing my own research on Syria, and you have no idea how many non-responses I'm getting from a lot of academics in my field, but also a lot of responses too. So I think obviously now I'm conducting it in COVID, so there is that factor too. But I just want to put it out there because I keep hearing I heard from a lot of academics with lived experience who complain that when they reach out to academics, they don't get any response, mainly because they just, probably sometimes they just not, they don't know how to deal with them. They don't know what to do with them, how to support them, etc. Not to give them false hope. And as we know, in every sector there are gatekeepers. So I think a lot of researchers are aware of a lot of things, a lot of support, a lot of opportunities where they could, support and empower. And again, as we've emphasized, I think in this panel, we need to move away from treating, if we continue to look at refugees or scholars with lived experience as vulnerable, traumatized, and because that would really limit our engagement with them. We're not going to see them as capable learners, as capable researchers. I'm just going to stop it there. I'm also aware of the time. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Rifaie, and I really appreciate you bringing us again back to the individual responsibility that yes, there are structural barriers and so on, but there's also a lot that can be done in the day-to-day work that each of us can contribute to. Tina, can I turn to you now and ask for your thoughts on what's needed to advance representation and incorporation of lived experiences? And I know we've talked separately before about, the phrase "nothing about us without us" and how I suppose, very easy to say that, and as someone mentioned already, to produce grand statements about how we're including and consulting and so on. But more concretely, you know, can you think or give us examples of good or even bad practice in pursuing these objectives? Over to you.
Thanks, Tamara. I think just super briefly on Nothing About Us Without Us, and Susan mentioned that it does originate from disability movement and was really adopted by the LGBTIQ civil rights movement. And for me, this phrase, we learn that, we live it through, you know, through the fight, the struggle, the blood, the sacrifice, the losses. And I think it cannot turn into that tokenistic phrase just because somebody invited one refugee on a panel, that mean they've done the meaningful inclusion. And I think we have to be always mindful of that, you know, quite often what I see, and in particular in the UN spaces, because the opportunities become sometimes for people with lived experience so unique, that they sort of, you know, agree to anything just to be at that table, but that's no meaningful inclusion because the power imbalances is still there in place. And I think if we think about best practices, you know, the best practice is about sharing that power, is about caring for the communities that you work with, and it's about being accountable back to those communities. So for me to give example, like best practice examples, it's difficult because you don't really have that many that actually currently exist that you could say, well, you know, this is something changed on the systemic level. But I guess what I want to focus is just a few tips that potentially, you know, can make those examples that, you know, occasionally happen with some people a more universal experience. And I think one is paying people. And I'm saying paying people because very often, and this happens so much in advocacy, people do choose between having income and participating to those opportunities. Because you know that if you're invited to LGBTIQ refugee roundtable by the UN, you're going to do it because it's one-in-time opportunity. And so, you know, regardless of what time, regardless if you have to take them off work, and a lot of us work in different places that are not necessarily the same space. And, you know, Susan mentioned that, you know, the refugee organizations in Australia are not led by refugees. So most of us are not working in refugee spaces, you know, on a day-to-day basis. And so paying people, you know, it's A, recognizing their expertise, and then B, making sure that, you know, because often, you know, we take time, that becomes your annual leave, your, you know, whatever personal leave, and so you actually lose on income. One of actually a really great example in this area is that I was invited to give a lecture to, I think it was University of Melbourne. However, there was no money in the course. And so the academic who invited me to give a lecture, she actually paid me from her own money. And I really appreciate that because, you know, we can say, well, the universities do not pay. But then, you know, quite often, you know, having the, and I know that particular academic, you know, we really have great connection, and, you know, for her, she's not there employed permanently and all of that, but to some degree, you know, that's also the individual responsibility that people, you know, take on and make choices. I think the point of accountability and reporting back what you're using from people, because sometimes I think, and, you know, people may give you particular perspectives and thoughts, and you see them completely differently. And then whatever comes out in that sort of theorization back in your work potentially may misrepresent, or, you know, it may say something that communities do not necessarily told you. And I think it's important to feed that back. Even if there is no immediate benefit to the community, at least they know how their knowledge and experiences have been used. We spoke about going beyond the storytelling, and, you know, I see, and this is quite a growing, I guess, tendency, is I do get invited quite a bit to do guest lectures for all sorts of different courses on displacement. And I think this is a fantastic opportunity, you know, on the one hand, you know, for me, I'm a PhD researcher, sort of having, you know, those experiences. But on the other hand, it is also about, you know, if people are just engaged in refugee led work, it is about, you know, them having access, you know, to kind of a broader audience. We need to really think about, again, who gets to be sitting at the table, because we do talk a lot about refugee representation, but when you start unpacking it, quite often it is men, quite often it is heterosexual men. And I think every time, you actually go and you want to engage with particular communities, are you collecting data on gender? Are you collecting data on sexuality or disability? Because those experiences are actually integral to people's lives and how they navigate their lives. And so if we do the research, and quite often I see this a lot, you do the research, for example, where you talk to refugee women, and I would ask a question, how many of them were queer? And I'm like, well, we didn't ask. But why you didn't ask? Because you come with an assumption that there is a very homogenous refugee group and there are others, exception from the rules. No, we have to mainstream intersectionality through everything that you do, because it does matter in policy, in particular in social policy, it does matter, and and in other kind of areas. And I also think that we have to be, I said that best practice is about caring, and what I meant by that is we have to take those trauma-informed responses. Yes, many refugees have traumas, and not necessarily those traumas are going to heal just because we are now in safety of resettlement. But it is about knowing that, it is about knowing how to engage with people and having been trained in those trauma-informed responses, just so both you as a researcher not re-traumatize yourself, through hearing to those experiences, but also how to properly engage with people. So I think, there's just kind of those few things, and I guess it is a practice, it is an ongoing work, because if a researcher or an activist or policymaker will say, well, we're doing intersectionality so well, we're so representative, there'll definitely be someone that is left behind that is not at that table. And I think it has to be the ongoing reflection and ongoing practice, without saying, well, we've been doing this for this many years, it's worked for us, we're going to continue doing it this way, because otherwise, it will kind of revert back to that sort of tokenism and not genuine actual interest in people's lives. Thanks.
Thanks so much, Tina, and your comments take me back to Susan's also about the sort of the business as usual process is not, or approach is not neutral. I'm going to finish with a question to Katerina, and then we will have a short amount of time for some questions and contributions from those of you joining us. So please, if you have them, do raise your hand, or I can see we already have a few interesting contributions in the chat. So we'll come to those next. But Katerina, let me finish by asking you about what are some good strategies or examples of good practice that you could share with us, and whether they're institutional or also about the role of individual international lawyers and scholars. Over to you.
I think it's important to note that I don't work in a law or an international law context, so it's very difficult for me to tailor this to, I think, most of the audiences and contexts and disciplines that you all work in and that you're engaged in. I have many friends who are lawyers and who work in the School of Law, including Susan and Jane. I'm based in interdisciplinary Pacific Island studies. So I imagine when I was invited to participate, there's that understanding that I'm coming from that context, and that we do have some approaches in our particular field for people working in the Pacific, especially, that may be useful and relevant to this discussion about changing approaches, methodologies, practices, thinking about issues of representation, the role of people who've had experiences of displacement, etc. And if I was to think about it from the kind of interdisciplinary Pacific studies that I'm in at the moment, our process has come through decolonization of the discipline, and thinking about what decolonization means, what that looks like in all its different facets. So Pacific studies for decades was very much dominated by white experts, Australians, New Zealanders, Americans, British, people who studied and worked on the Pacific. It has colonial roots. One of the very first research centers at the ANU, where I'm based, was the Research School of Pacific Studies. It was seen to be a very important and strategic area of research and engagement and policy in the region, and has this long and deep history and now very strong international reputation. But that work, that research, those relationships weren't built by people of Pacific Island heritage or descent. So there's always been, especially during the 90s, a sharp kind of pushback from Pacific Islanders who then started to get trained and get their degrees and become academics, questioning the paradigm were, operating in, where it wasn't our people doing the research, it wasn't our people writing the papers and making the policy recommendations and teaching, or many of the researchers who worked on the Pacific also were part of the creation of Pacific legal frameworks and constitutions and everything else. You had historians from ANU go out into the Pacific and work on, the constitution of Samoa or Papua New Guinea or Fiji, etc. So they weren't just academics, they were in the region doing, shaping the kinds of nation states that now, independent nation states that now exist in the Pacific. So through a process of critical decolonizing, which resulted in a move from what in Pacific Island studies we understand to be a pragmatic approach to our field and our discipline, or a laboratory approach to our field, to one of empowerment. So there was this real move from, when I say pragmatic, I'm talking about fields like Pacific politics, Pacific IR, Pacific security and strategic studies, etc. When I'm talking about laboratory, I'm talking about linguistics, archaeology, anthropology, where the Pacific becomes like this laboratory to think about human things. There was this active shift to refocusing what Pacific Island Studies was and who it was for by centering Pacific people, their voices, their experiences, their approaches, their methods, and their knowledges. So it became not just a decolonizing process, but an indigenizing process, which we then drew from Indigenous studies. For example, Indigenous studies in all its different manifestations in New Zealand, in Aotearoa New Zealand, in Hawaii, in Australia, and elsewhere. So this combination of interdisciplinarity, indigeneity, and empowerment, so that Pacific studies became more of a place, grounded and rooted in places, and hopefully led by Pacific peoples themselves. And it's an ongoing process. It hasn't fully transformed the field, but that's kind of the genealogy within academia that I'm coming from, where I was trained by people, whether it was Hawaiians or Solomon Islanders or Fijians, who were part of this process of trying to reframe and reconfigure how we do Pacific Island studies by ensuring that it was led by Pacific peoples, which is an ongoing project. But now, in the context of things like work on climate change, this is why often in that space, Pacific voices and approaches and experiences are centered, because by the time climate change became one of the most important areas of research in the Pacific, that work, that decolonization work, had already been done. So it was hard to do or think about climate change and climate issues without centering Pacific people's experiences and voices and approaches. This still lack of, there isn't full equity at all in that space. There's definitely still power imbalances, and research projects primarily are led, especially the ones with the big grants, are not led by Pacific people. So you will have people who get the ARC or the other grants, their names are on the grants, and then yes, they may have partners or interlocutors or others that they work with on the ground who are Pacific people, but it's not always Pacific people who are the academics or the researchers leading and are named on grants. So one of those things that I think needs to be transformed is imagining how in the context of research you achieve real equity and a real balance of power by the ways in which Pacific or other peoples are brought in, and the kinds of positionalities they occupy within things like funded research projects. That's something that, you know, I think are challenges, especially in the Australian context, that we need to work through. And yes, there aren't so many of us, you know, in the academy, but it's growing. You know, there's a growing number of Pacific Islander, Indigenous, South Sea Islander, Aboriginal Torres Strait peoples who are academics, who have qualifications, who are trained, who are the experts themselves, and from the communities that people are studying. We're definitely overstudied. The Pacific is one of the most overstudied parts of the whole world, but if we are going to be overstudied, it might as well be led by Pacific people. And that's something I'm very particular about and very committed to. So it's sort of training up the next generation of Pacific Islander scholars to work, you know, in this space, because all the work that I do is with my family. I'm related to all of them. So we're operating in a context of kinship, which is actually much harder than being an outsider researcher coming in to do the work. We have to navigate so many layers of kinships and relationships and politics and issues going back in time, back to the time of our ancestors when we do this kind of research. So we really move through that space. If you're an Indigenous Pacific person working on a Pacific project, you move through all of that in a really different way.
Katerina, thank you. I know you started with what almost sounded like an apology for not being a lawyer, but really, you know.
Oh no, I'm not apologizing.
Good. But really, you know, there's a wonderful lesson, I think, in this. You know, maybe it's not the best practice example, but it is an area where progress has been made of the need to look interdisciplinarily and to really, you know, and so for international lawyers, I think I know myself, I was very much trained and much of my research has been very what we call black letter law, which means we don't really look outside the law, but we're hearing so clearly about the limitations and the structural biases of that. So there's a real, I think, imperative and going beyond something that's good to do to almost an obligation to look outside the frameworks that we use to understand the world and to look at which perspectives and which frameworks are missing and should be brought into the centre, and to think about how can we indigenize forced displacement, you know, the equivalent of indigenization. I haven't got a good verb yet, but you know, maybe that's a quest for the next panel. We do have another 5 minutes. I'd really love if anyone has questions or comments or reflections that you would like to add, please do pop your hand up. We would love to hear from you. I'm sure plenty of people are keen to head off for a coffee as well. Perhaps just before we just while people are thinking about if there's anything they would like to add, I might go to a comment that Anthea Vogel has made earlier in the session that I see, Susan, you've just replied to, and I haven't read your response, but it particularly asks, Anthea's comment particularly asks us to think beyond the usual, I suppose, sources of authority in this field, you know, UNHCR and others, and to think about where else can we look. And I suppose this is in some ways a sort of top-down versus bottom-up approach, but in particular Anthea asks about refugee-led organisations and their policies and what we can learn from them, or how they could be given, I suppose, more a better place. I wonder, Tina, if you, sorry to put you on the spot, or perhaps, you know, Rifaie also want to make any comment about, you know, it seems to me that refugee-led organisations are getting some more attention and support with the advent of the Global Compact on Refugees. I wonder if you have any reflections on those developments and what seems to be working well or what's not. Over to you.
I guess, you know, I think the Global Refugee Compact was one of the catalyzers, but I think there's been quite a bit of development before that as well. And so, you know, within Australia, we start to see quite a bit of refugee-led advocacy. I put in the chat Forcibly Displaced People Network. We exclusively work on LGBTIQ forced displacement. There is National Refugee-led Advocacy and Advisory Group called NRAG, as well, representing people in all states and territories. And then, you know, every sort of state and territory has kind of their own ones, groups. I guess the challenge quite often is that you know, we do work, but quite often all of us are unresourced, right? We're all unfunded as an NGOs because money are flowing to kind of larger ones. And so sometimes the capacity to produce those sources of information, you know, those policy positions and statements that can just sit on our websites, or even the capacity to have a website to pay for hosting and that kind of stuff is quite limited. However, that expertise really exists, and it is about sort of trying to find out who those groups and to talk to people, to engage them. And I think there is that kind of growing movement globally as well in terms of, just saying, well, we exist, we can contribute, we should be equal partners at those decision-making tables, and you have to really count our voices. And, I guess we're moving really beyond the narratives of like, we're so grateful that, we finally can be somewhere in safety. If you are in a privileged position to be in a safety to like, excuse me, but you have to take into account what we say and what we think, because also quite often when we think about as well, like refugee camps and other displacement settings, it is refugee-led organizations who do such a huge bulk of work of supporting communities, of connecting communities, and helping them navigate, and quite often without any resources as well, compared to like large international NGOs. So I think there is some really promising practices in this space in terms of, really seeing what people want. For FDPN, 2 years ago, we launched Canberra Statement on access to safety and justice for LGBTQ refugees, which was a co-designed document by LGBTQ refugees, then, consulted with the conference entities that does tell, this is what we want, like this is the state of things and this is what we want. And we just ask you to sign up for it and kind of do things. And I guess it's also kind of a question of success, because a lot of people are like, yeah, we'll do that. And then they actually don't do the action, as I said kind of before. So I think it is about really doing your homework, who's who in the field, and having that ongoing engagement.
Wonderful, thanks so much. One other comment I'm just reading in the chat comes, I've just lost it here, from Melanie O'Brien. Thanks, Melanie. Really about, I suppose, practical access for researchers who, let's say, I'm taking all of this on board. I realise that I need to speak and collaborate with people and so on, and we've heard about some of the practical barriers in this panel. Susan mentioned some of the impacts that just ethics application processes can have on engaging with refugee and other communities. I wonder if anyone would like to share any, I suppose, tips, for international lawyers or other researchers who are listening to this thinking, I really want to go out there and learn more. Does anyone have any suggestions for, where should they start? What steps can people take beyond attending discussions like this one? And I realise I'm putting our panellists very much on the spot, but just before we finish, if anyone would like to wave at me or just start talking to share any tips, that would be great. Or perhaps if no one has any, we need to arrange a follow-up where we can flesh these out more. I'll take that as a cue to that we need a second panel. All right, so I really hope that everyone has found this as really valuable as I have. And I'd like to really conclude firstly by thanking all of our excellent panellists, to Rifaie, to Tina, to Susan, to Katerina and Tristan. It's been such a privilege to hear and to learn from you all. I know that I will take a lot of your messages into my own work, and I'm sure that others will as well. Also, thank you to everyone who has joined this session for taking the time to listen and to reflect on these questions of participation and perspective and representation, which, as I noted at the outset, are not questions that are unique to international law relating to displacement, but apply elsewhere as well, albeit in different ways depending on different fields. Finally, this panel has been part of the Kaldor Centre for International Refugee Law's commitment to advancing progress on this topic and to representation within the field of international refugee law, and part of our recent strategic framework, in which we have really pledged to do more to incorporate lived experiences within all of our work and to enhance opportunities for those with lived experiences to participate in that work. So I'd like to finish really with an open invitation to all of you, while we will certainly be taking and have been taking notes from today's session to take back and to reflect on and so on, we'd also love to hear from you if you have further ideas or if you'd like to explore with us ways of doing that. So please do be in touch. So with that, thank you to everyone. Enjoy your afternoon and the rest of your day and week, and we hope to see you again soon. Thanks, everyone.